So I thought that today I'll open it up to question and answers. Oh, and there's a hand up already. That's great. Rather than me talking, I did have something to say in the time that I was going to wait for a hand to go up, but now there's two hands up, so I don't need to do that. I will remind folks that there's an intensive coming up, starting not this Monday but the following Monday. The title, the topic is integration and critical thinking. So I'll touch on, well, I will focus on that, but really it's integration and critical thinking with regard to the main core of the teaching, which is non-doership and non-attachment, peace of mind, which all comes from one's attitude, which comes from the way one sees life, the way one understands oneself to be, and understands how things on the biological and psychological level happen, which really means understanding that life is a happening, that we're all functioning according to essentially factors outside of our control. And experientially, that isn't how things are felt, and so because the feeling makes it seem like it is happening differently, happening because of a me that is in control, then that tends to be the deeply ingrained idea we have of ourself and of life. And so that means we operate from this sense of doership, which means an attitude of doership, which means an attitude of blame towards the other, hatred towards the other, shame and guilt towards oneself, seeing the other as separate, a competitor, an enemy, a rival. And there's a whole commentary around that view of life that can just fall away if that view of life falls away. So that will still be the main core of the intensive. So if anyone's interested in spending 2 hours each day for 6 days, that starts next Monday, next Sunday for you guys in the States. Information's on the website. So Francois, hi.
Hi, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, very well.
Okay. If you have some troubles understanding my words because of my accent, don't hesitate to tell me.
Sure. No, okay? I'm good at deciphering foreign accents, and French is an easy one for me.
Okay. So I wanted, it's the first time I coming to your Zoom in direct, in live, but I listened and watched a lot of your video recently. And so I had, in fact, not a question, I had 2 remarks to share with you and see how do you feel about it. And before I get on it shortly, I just want to tell you that I am completely on the same spot than you about seeing things, how they are. And I will add to that you are the only one I can see on the people I know about it that are the closest to me to see certain things. And just to say that I understand perfectly what you said about how it's going on.
That's a good starting point, or at least good information to have. Yes.
Yeah, to know, to be sure that you know where I start from. And yes. My first remark, it was about your sayings about what we are really looking for. It's for the end of suffering, for happiness, being a peace of mind. And on this particular saying, I tried to see if it was accurate for me. It was right for me. And in fact, I noticed that it was not really this for me when I start my quest, because I wanted to know the truth, and truth for me was just a description with words about how the things are, and it was not about specific things as reality or something like that, like consciousness or something like that. And even if the truth that I will discover was not very comfortable, if it will bring more suffering to me, I didn't care. I just wanted to know what is the truth. That's all. And after I get satisfaction on the answer I came up with, the side effect was uh, less suffering until maybe it was completely absent. But just to, for me, it was like really a side effect. And if someone has proposed me to get the end of suffering, I will not be able to be interested in it unless, it was based on something I feel true and accurate. So if he proposed me,
I agree.
You agree? If you propose me something like a pills to take or a belief to take and to try to see to get rid of suffering, I will not be able to get it. And I think what you do in your teachings is going to the point to give happiness to some people who can get it, but it's through the medicine of what is true. If it is not true, it will not bring what you expect to, that it will be the end of suffering.
Yes. So there's some nuances in this particular topic. So I think what how I would rephrase what you're saying is that for Francois, where the seeking started was not seeking for peace of mind, let's say, or the end of suffering, or whatever I say, we're really looking for. What you're stating is that for Francois, it was a seeking for truth. And to me, that's a description of your process, right? Of where your process started. So I think very few people start off saying, oh, what I'm really looking for is peace of mind. So when I say, what are we really looking for? I'm not providing a description of what most seekers are seeking. Most seekers aren't seeking peace of mind. Most seekers are seeking whatever resonates with their particular structure at that point of the seeking. And a seeker starts off essentially with a very particular structure, i.e., an egoic structure in place. And so what is appealing to the egoic structure is not at all what is really available. What is appealing to the egoic structure is usually something, and the idea of truth is appealing because deep down, it's not only the idea of truth, but intuitively we feel at some point we say, I just want the truth. I don't care what the truth is. I just feel like I need truth. And my rationale as to why we feel so drawn to truth intuitively is because we sort of understand that we are holding a mask up in front of ourself when we interact with the world. We've spent a whole lifetime pretending to be someone, putting on a show to get love or appreciation or whatever. And at some point, it just feels inauthentic. And so there's a deep movement away from how we have lived towards, I want to know truth. So that's what I would say you're saying. But imagine if you're seeking for truth, delivered you ongoing suffering, right? Let's say that's what happened. You found out the truth, but it didn't deliver the byproduct of peace of mind. I would suggest that if you were seeking truth, you found truth, and then it just left you with an uncomfortableness of self, if that was the case, you'd remain dissatisfied, because uncomfortableness with oneself, suffering, is what is driving us to seek for something, because there is this uncomfortableness. And it's, in my way of seeing it, it's only when that uncomfortableness falls away that we stop seeking, because we're not driven to seek something better, because there isn't this uncomfortableness. We are then more aligned and at peace with life, and we can say, life is okay how it is. It's fine. But that's because the internal suffering has been cleared up. That's why we can stop. That's why we find seeking stops. So from that perspective, we can then say, oh, I started off seeking truth. And as a consequence of seeking truth, suffering came to an end. And it is the fact that suffering came to an end that is really what allows the seeking to stop, what allows life to be lived in peace or happily or with contentment. And so it's from that point of view that I'm saying that's what we're really looking for. So in a way, it's changing the seeking from being maybe a bit disconnected from practical, because when we're seeking truth, we don't really know what the truth is, right? We're seeking the truth, but we don't know what it is. And so I think by refocusing the seeking, which will only happen at a certain point for some seekers, by refocusing the seeking on the end of suffering, it means that we suddenly start seeing the suffering, what it is, seeing that it is attitudinal, that it's psychological, seeing that it's based on blame, on shame, on expectation, on wanting things to be different, on always being in resistance to what's happening, all of that. And the more familiar we become with the different forms of suffering, then the more we see that as thought forms, as something not what we are. So there is then the capacity for there to be a distance from it. That distance then means the relativity of it gets seen. So all of that is the process. I agree that our peace of mind comes from something authentic, something that we can call truth, something that is not mind-made. So I can't disagree that peace of mind comes from what we could call truth. So then we could say, really, it's a seeking for who I am or what is real, the truth. And connected to that is peace of mind. So I wouldn't disagree if someone said, really, what a seeker is seeking for is truth. I agree. But intertwined or connected to that, like the other side of that coin, is the consequence of truth, the consequence of knowing, being that truth. And the consequence in practical terms is the end of suffering. So the statement, what we're really looking for to me is just maybe shifting a seeker that is stuck in seeking for something theoretical or something that is not practical. It might allow them to say, oh, actually, yes, this helps my seeking take on a new movement. So it isn't at all that what you're saying is wrong. I'm just suggesting why we can phrase it differently, because the two things, truth and peace of mind, are essentially not separate. They are two ends of the one dynamic.
Yeah, if I completely agree, and I saw why you may say this kind of thing, and I will add to it maybe that it's the best thing you will get from knowing the truth, to not suffer, to get happiness as peace of mind.
Yes, I would go as far as to say, if we didn't get peace of, the truth to me would be worthless.
Yeah, it will be even maybe worse than before.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the second things I wanted to say, it's about when you talk about other teachings, like when you qualify them as top-down or bottom-up teachings, and you talk about these teachings as methodology to get some points very specifically. And I can agree with this, but I will make a little remark. It's about, it will depend if the teacher who use this kind of teachings or another one has the same truth than me or than you, and you can use this methodology or this tool to get to a point with a specific seeker. But sometimes it's not a methodology if they have this only tool that they see as truth. So maybe the intention of the teacher is not always to use a tool, but to say what he believes is right. And so my point was clearly that I consider that teachings in spirituality can be not accurate, or can be sometimes even very wrong, even if they talk about the same thing at the beginning. But it will do what it's supposed to do on people who are in touch with this. And it will maybe getting to end of suffering or getting to some satisfying truth, but it will not be really true for, in a sense of if we talk about absolute truth. And so it was just a point to sometimes I think you are very nice and understanding to some teachings that they are not really what you describe.
Yeah, so I completely agree that some teachers don't actually realize that what they are putting forward is a methodology. And maybe when a teacher doesn't realize that what they're putting forward is a methodology, then we can say it's not, well, in the way you said it, you say it's not really truth, because essentially they don't realize what they are doing or what is happening. Now, the funny thing that I notice is that even if a teacher doesn't realize that what they are putting forward is a methodology, where, as you say, they actually believe it is a description of truth, let's say. So a teacher might say, you know, what I'm saying is not conceptual, what I'm saying is not a teaching. I'm not interested in changing someone's conditioning. They could say that, right? And they might not realize that no matter what they're talking about, even if they talk about the absolute and formless and they don't put it in words that are logical, because when someone talks logically, then it seems much more like a concept, a teaching, a new conditioning. Whereas when someone talks poetically, it doesn't seem like new conditioning. But my point, and I think the point you are making and appreciating, is that however anyone talks, whether they talk logically or poetically, it is new conditioning being received by someone. And that's why I say that all teachings, whether the teacher realizes it or not, is essentially a methodology. It isn't the truth. It is something that might talk about what we call truth, that may or may not make a change in someone. And if someone speaking, a result of those words brings about change in someone, then I say that is a methodology. And I completely agree with you that many teachers, especially ones that haven't had the experience that they're talking about for decades, because at the beginning, you can have very profound experiences and put words to that, and there is a degree of profundity and wisdom and insight in those words, but the teacher's not really that experienced in the various changes that happen over a period of time, the change in their insights, the change in their perspective. And so I think a lot of teachers that are relatively new in describing this don't really understand the role of a teaching. And yet it can still bring about, like you said, it can still bring about significant benefit for people, because if the seeker hears something and it changes something in their thinking, it allows them to see something new, well, that could be a very big breakthrough. And so that's why I'm not really particularly critical, even if I say, a teacher who is, relatively new to that experience. It can sound like it's a criticism, even if I say they don't really understand the role of teachings. I'm very happy with the fact that it will be what it will be, and I can see how it can deliver great shifts for people if what they say is exactly what is needed to crack something open.
Yeah, I completely understand what you say. And this, my thing was sometimes it could be very not accurate and still brings something that is not really a benefit. In I mean, if we take the idea of getting to the truth and the end of suffering, but still it's what is supposed to happen. And it reminds me about what I think Nisargadatta says about spirituality being the ultimate scam. You understand what I mean? And because it could be very wrong and still brings a very satisfying things for people. And it doesn't matter. It could be suffering sometimes much more than before, but it's the way it is, and that's why I like to. I used to like watching teachings, very different teachings that were very wrong according to me, but was bringing something in my mind that was interesting in comparison to my truth, and that had also this benefit on me to hear something very wrong, because it was making some points on my truth and making me seeking for more accuracy in my and precision in my truth. And that's why. And to finish, because I will let people after talk. The thing I listened a video a few yesterday that was really pointing in a discussion with someone about your not knowing about for absolute about the self, that you couldn't be sure about what is the self, and you were talking about the fact that if it was a computer that was only making us believe in consciousness, in this I am, it could be possible. We will not know about it. And that was the most thing I had at the end of my understanding. It was the fact that if all the thing I feel is true was not true indeed, I couldn't know it different.
I think that's an important point for sure. We sometimes, like, I'm not saying that I'm not in touch with the feeling of self, That I'm in touch with. But what I'm saying is I don't know where that comes from. We feel it, and because it's so different to the nature of thought, for example, then when we compare the two, we say, oh, thought is very relative, and the sense of self is the truth. It's absolute. It's not, and we say we know experientially it's not of the same quality as thought. But there's a critical thinking error there if we just compare two things, because one, they're different, right? And let's say we see the relativity and the non-truth of thought, and then we've heard in teachings when they're pointing to the self that it is, the teachings say it is truth, it is reality, it is unchanging, and therefore it is truth. And we just believe these statements. I'm not saying the statements are wrong. I'm saying the statements are effective parts of methodology to bring about awakenings to that. And then at some point, when our own critical thinking gets very strong, then we say, actually, there is a feeling of self, but let's say quantum computing is very, very powerful. Who knows? Quantum computing, computation could create this exactly the feeling that we are in touch with, that sense of self. And because I don't know what the capacity of quantum computing, not necessarily that we have available in our reality, but quantum computing that might be exponentially much more powerful. I don't know what capacity that has to create what sort of experience within a virtual system that it could create. And so then I say, well, we might be in a virtual system, and the sense of self that feels so real is simply one component created in that virtual system. And I think it's lovely to get to the point where I go, I really don't know, but it's irrelevant. I don't, because I'm not seeking to know. I'm just seeking to be at peace. And so being in touch with that we call self is part of the peace setting in. And so that's why it's important, I think, to realize we're looking for peace, because otherwise the fact that we don't know wouldn't be something we could actually settle on, because it would be too unsettling for us to say, I don't know, when we think we are trying to find out the truth. So once we know we're looking for peace and we have peace, then I say, I don't care whether it is the self is created from a computer, or whether it's God, or whether it is the self of the body, or whether it is the self of a universal consciousness. I say, I know there is self, but I don't know where it comes from, and frankly, I don't care.
Yes, as you say, when you get peace of mind, it's enough, and especially when you know that you can not know for sure. It
Yes.
brings peace, and you're okay with that. It was really nice to talk with you, and I'm very happy, and we may do it again once or twice.
Yes, you'd be very welcome. I enjoyed talking with you. Thank you, Francois.
Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome. Cecilia, hi.
Hi, Roger. Lovely.
Nice to see you again.
Lovely to see you again. Thank you. Okay, as you know, because I've been talking, you've heard me talk several times. I lost the two most significant relationships in my life. The ones that I had with the entities who were here for a while, but they were true. Like I could count on, I could count on them being, on truth being told to me, like in the dealings every day. And what I'm finding it very difficult now is, my relationships with other people, because I find that there are often misunderstandings that crop up. There's sort of what I perceive to be unreliability, I don't feel that there is often a lot of truth. And, and then people go, leave, they come, they leave from one's life. And I just was wondering how do the teachings, what do the teachings point to be able to help us to navigate not just ourselves and finding our truth, but also being able to relate to other people? I don't know if the teachings do point to this, because as a Gadatas often say, embrace aloneness if you really want to get anywhere. So this is what I've been trying to struggle with. Well, not trying, I've been struggling with at the moment, is how to have peace of mind still, through the dealings with other people, dealing with oneself, but this is one thing, but dealing with other people and being able to accept, or being able to, exactly take it in and not resist anything, not have expectations, none of that, and just be able to deal with whatever comes up, in the flow of life in relation to others. So I'd appreciate it if you could address that, if you think it's worth addressing.
Yeah. Well, teachings point to the fact that we're not looking for integrity in relationship. We're looking for peace of mind. It doesn't specifically say we're not looking for integrity in relationship. It says we're not looking for outcomes. We're not looking for happiness through outcomes. A seeker usually is, right? So once again, when the teaching says we're not looking for happiness through outcomes, it's not describing how seekers are living their life. It's describing the reality beyond the limitation of the egoic movement. So it's almost like a guide of signposts or wisdom, truths, whatever. So it says your happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain. Your happiness is not to be found in outcomes. So don't label outcomes as an addition or a subtraction of your happiness. So it's basically saying, be clear with yourself that outcomes are going to give you more pleasure or more pain. That is the nature of outcomes. And interhuman interaction, including whether someone is honest with you or whether someone is playing games, whether someone is, trying to get something from you, all of that is part of the flow of life, part of circumstance, part of outcomes. And so if we become clear more and more, and we become more and more clear about what parts of life are circumstance, which really means expanding. It's really quite simple. All of life is circumstance, but because of our attachment to outcome, glorifies certain outcomes, certain circumstances, and doesn't allow the working mind to say that is just circumstance, because we hold it so dear to us that we, in a way, can't bring ourselves to just say that is just circumstance. And the more and more capacity we have to see more and more outcomes as circumstance, including relationships, then the more and more likely we are to not get caught up in outcomes. Because we get caught up in outcomes when we forget that that is just circumstance, that is at best pleasure and at worst pain, and that the happiness that is really available is not a happiness through pleasure or pain. And so as we become clearer and clearer, when someone lets you down, there is going to be a dissatisfaction, or there is going to be a feeling that this is not as good as if someone, delivered something wonderful to you. But that so we shouldn't expect it's all exactly the same, right? We shouldn't expect that someone letting you down is going to feel exactly the same as someone, you know, doing wonderful things for you. But hopefully we start to see the biological feeling, meaning the part that makes sense. It's a bit like, you know, if someone throws cold water on you, there is going to be a feeling that is not as pleasant as if someone didn't throw the cold water on you. So we can start to feel the biological pain of the interaction, and hopefully it doesn't turn into psychological involvement. And if it does turn into psychological involvement, which it's bound to until the attachment and the clarity sets in, hopefully that psychological involvement starts getting cut off quicker and quicker and quicker as the understanding goes deeper and deeper. So that's basically the most important thing, I think, that the teaching points at in relation to interhuman relationship. I'd also, in a way, go in expecting humans to let you down, not where you expect it and essentially bring it on yourself and sabotage relationships from being good. Not expected where you don't expect anything other than that, because that would be going too far, right? You'd be essentially become a cynical person who isn't willing to have relationships. But in your openness to relationships, hold in your understanding about humans that a human is really going to be self-serving, especially if there is a psychological entity that is strong, or at least that even if the psychological entity falls away, we're still essentially self-serving. We're still going to move towards pleasure. If the psychological entity is there and it's strong, then there's going to be a whole extra dynamic of self-servingness. So if you go out with that understanding into the world, you go, I'm not surprised that interhuman relationships are self-serving. And then we tend to be less disappointed because we've gone out with a realistic outlook, which means we don't have an expectation that life is pleasure, 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 or an expectation that interhuman relationships are only going to deliver us, you know, pleasure. So that might also help.
Well, it's just because, you know, you everywhere you look, you know, and read, like psychologists are always saying about how, you know, one cannot survive really without other people, and that if you know, if you read everywhere, you'll see that, you know, anything. I don't know. You must have come across this, and yet it seems to me that the teachings don't always agree with what they're saying. But everything I look, and you know, that if you don't have friends, you're a loser. You know, if you're not good at interpersonal relationships, that there's something wrong with you. It's like that it's important that if you don't, you know people and have all this kind of stuff, that, you know, there must be something wrong with you, or you're going to suffer, you're going to fall into depression. You know, you everywhere I've looked, and you read this everywhere, like it's in all the manuals, it's in. So, and do you agree with this? Like from the perspective,
I think
you know, the perspective of enlightenment, it doesn't really make sense to me what is being said there. Am I wrong? Like,
sure. Like, well, no, you're not sure. You're not wrong. I agree that that's not really how it is. And I would say that the teachings or systems that talk about that are not really talking about the happiness that this teaching is talking about. It might be more talking about happiness as is more conventionally sought, which really means better life circumstance, better situation. So there are plenty of systems that will be telling you how to, I don't know, generate an income, how to develop online businesses, how to develop interpersonal skills. And there's nothing wrong with those systems. They are a science, possibly, about how to improve those areas of your life. But we can very easily hear a system that is talking about self-improvement and think it is talking about what is most important, or think that it is talking about the same thing as non-dual teachings or this teaching or whatever. And the thing is, it's not. It's talking about whatever it's talking about, which could be self-improvement, it could be financial improvement, it could be interpersonal skills improvement, it could be your cooking skills improvement, and they're all valid in and of themselves. You know, if you learn how to cook better, that might deliver an improvement in certain areas of your life, pleasure, essentially. So there isn't anything wrong with pursuing that. But often when we pursue something thinking it will deliver an improvement, we mistake that improvement for our happiness. And then essentially we start saying, that program says it's very important to have good interpersonal skills, and I don't have good interpersonal skills, and therefore if I'm going to be happy, I need to be different. I need to improve. And that's a very slippery slope, because we've then taken up the mantle again of my happiness is to be found in being a perfect person.
Yes, but it's primarily because they seems to point to the fact that, you know, aloneness and solitude is something bad, that it'll lead a person to depression if you don't interact with other people.
Well, maybe it will for a lot of people. That's something for you to find out for yourself, right? Like my experience is, I don't know if that's true for me, because the reality is that I see people every now and again. I don't see a lot of people a lot of the time. I can stay at my home for a week or two without going out. And in that time, I don't find myself getting depressed. I'm as happy then as I am when I meet someone. So overall, I would say I prefer to be on my own. But having said that, I know I'm rarely on my own for more than, 5 days, 10 days, whatever. And so there's a difference between completely alone, like if you were to wake up in a world that has no humans and you are on your own, as opposed to spending a lot of time alone, but then being able to dip into human relationship, once every 10 days or once every 3 days or whatever. There's a difference between the two. And I don't think it's worth considering the no one else on earth business. It's just not how our lives are. So the point of can we be comfortable on our own? I would say absolutely. That is the whole point of liberation, is to find a comfortableness with oneself.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, Kerry. Are you there, Kerry? Okay. So how about Harleen? Harleen is after Raghu. Hi, Raghu.
Hi, Roger. How are you?
Hello. Yes, very well, thanks. How are you?
Good. So my question is about like when there's a conflict between a working mind and checking in with the body to see what feels right as the next thing to do in life, like how to kind of navigate that terrain. And it could be things like if I go to yoga, if I go and take a yoga class, I'll feel better next day and the following week. And if I do work, rather than just laying on a couch, I wouldn't have to be, my energy wouldn't be leaking in the work, and there would be consequences of not doing my work. So in a lot of these kind of areas, because the last we spoke, I think it was probably the first time I spoke with you, we talked about checking into the body and, trying and experimenting in kind of situations that are not high impact, so to say, to begin with. And then I noticed the conflict between that I guess I'm just kind of framing it as a conflict between working mind and what feels like I want to do in the body. So how do I navigate?
Yes. The problem might be that it's not actually the working mind that you're comparing it with. It could be something to do with the thinking mind also. And so I guess the way, in my case, when I was experimenting with this, I was happy to treat what I felt like doing as a guide for my destiny. And so even if theoretically something was better, I would say, but that's not my destiny. And what I wanted at that point was to find what felt like the tracks that were the smooth tracks, or the tracks where I wasn't. So there's always tracks. You're always on some track, right? Even if you're living completely from the thinking mind, you're still on track, and it is your destiny. But it's the way I envisaged it for me is like, yes, but I'm on a track that has resistance, almost like a rubber band is being stretched for me to be on that track. And so if I have to sort of stretch this rubber band to be on this particular track, I'm on it, but it's not the default, the natural, the harmonious, because there's a resistance to be on that track. And so I said, I want to be on the track that has no resistance for me. And so then I said, okay, that's I want to be on the smooth track, let's say. And furthermore, I then said that they're all destiny. So the move from destiny, which is the track with resistance, to to destiny, which is the track with no resistance, was an easy move for me to make. Because by saying and really deeply appreciating that wherever I am is my destiny. And so I said, if I move to the easy track, then my attitude is that is your destiny. But now there is ease. I was happy to forego certain outcomes for that ease in my particular movement. I said, what is most important is this ease. And so I said, if I lose certain things as a consequence of having ease, and that ease was a non misalignment, or the absence of let's put it in this positive. The ease was an alignment with what the body felt. I had enough of going out when I was tired, for example. So a simple example of ease there is when I'm tired, I want to sleep, or I want to, if I don't, I want to sit on the couch or whatever. So for me, at that time, the priority of ease became my priority. It also, in as far as I was concerned, it equated to peace of mind. That ease equated to peace of mind. It was like, I've found the place where I can say, I'm tired, so I'm not going to go out. And then I found that there wasn't a struggle, a psychological struggle, with the fact that I should go out, I'm going out when I'm tired. All of that fell away. And so I found that ease was really peace of mind. And there was something inside that said that peace of mind is what's important. And so if there are consequences, I'll live with the consequences. So that means I was willing to lose relationships, if that was the consequence of finding peace of mind. If I found I didn't feel natural, it didn't feel natural to buy presents for someone on Christmas or on a certain occasion, then there was this dropping of the insistence that's what I had to do. And so I came to ease because I didn't feel like going to look for a present or spending the money on a present or whatever the dynamic was. And so I just said, it's okay if you don't take a present. That's your line. And then, the thinking would say, but what are they going to think? And I said, that's okay. It doesn't really matter what they think. You've found your line, your ease, your align. And then there was peace of mind with it. My thinking didn't turn out into then there being suffering about what will they think. There might have been a thought, what will they think? And then my thinking says, well, that's just a consequence, which is pleasure or pain. And I was happy to suffer that consequence. And the reality is that, a lot of the things we might think are going to be problematic when we don't do something, don't actually turn out to be anywhere near as problematic as we might imagine they might be. So that's how I navigated. I just took that as my guide. I often would say that is my instruction from God. The feeling is the instruction from God. I'd also say that the doing things from shoulds and shouldn'ts, that also is an instruction from God, but it's an instruction from God that leads to uncomfortableness. Then there's the other instruction from God that leads to comfortableness. And so I took the instruction from God that led to comfortableness, which was for me abandoning consequence and doing what I feel like. Now, when I describe it, though, it might miss out some nuances that were actually in play, because what I mean by that is my biological intelligence may not have done some things that I felt like, because the consequence for some things might have been too great, and I was concerned about them. Now, this wasn't conscious, but what I'm saying is that there might be an intelligence that says, no, the option to not go to work isn't there for you. Now we have to be careful, I guess, whether that's a should or a shouldn't, or whether it's a biological intelligence. So another way of framing it is that if you have to do something because of your circumstance, then that just might become something you have no option to change, because the consequence would just be ridiculous, let's say. And if that is the case, then you have the attitude is a bit like if I wanted to fly. You know, if I said I want to fly as one of my options, I'd realize I don't have wings. So drop that off as a wish, right? Because if I had a wish, I wish I could fly, and I have no wings, it's sort of like an unrealistic expectation that's just going to create frustration, because I can't fly, but I want to fly. And so once you realize I can't fly because I don't have wings, so having the wish to fly is ridiculous, right? Yeah. So I drop it. And so that might apply to certain things, like because theoretically we could say you don't have to go to work. But it might not be an option. But then we have to be very careful, right? That's not just the way that we keep our shoulds and shouldn'ts in place, by saying I don't have an option. Because the attachment will say you don't have an option, when in fact there is an option. So you have to navigate that.
So that's helpful, and the nuances that are kind of really I guess, like, I wouldn't say like a tricky, or the key to kind of, I guess there's learning through experience. I mean, there are some areas, so there's work or physical health or some, but there's another area like smoking weed, for example. I did have a healthy relationship for span a couple of years. Now not so, but every time it kind of comes back, I see that it kind of clouds my mind, and that the top down part of this teaching, I feel like I'm just kind of away from that, at least for that period of time. So I'm curious, how do I navigate that, or is it more to do with thinking mind that's making me want to smoke weed as opposed to like sitting by myself alone?
I mean, probably we tend to want to do things that aren't that healthy for us. So let's assume that's not healthy for you. I'm not really saying it isn't. There'll be plenty of people that will have a different view. But let's say that drinking too much, certain drugs or whatever, don't deliver healthy outcomes. Often we find ourselves compelled to do those things because of an uncomfortableness that's in the system. And it temporarily creates a relief from the uncomfortableness. And so we keep going back to it, but it in itself over time causes a different problem, and maybe in the end creates more uncomfortableness. Anyway, now, if we take the view, the conceptual view that says that's not good for me, I shouldn't do it, we may not be breaking the pattern, we might just be resisting it. And so once again, in my experience, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that this would work for everyone, because maybe with certain addictive personalities that are different to how mine was, what I'm going to suggest might not be appropriate. in my case, I allowed myself to do these things because I didn't have a particularly addictive personality. So I would allow myself to do something if I felt like it. And inevitably, if it does deliver negative consequences, the fact that I was very aware of patterns and consequences meant that in a relatively short period of time, after having given myself the freedom to do those things, I would pick up the pattern that it delivered a consequence beyond the short-term satisfaction. And I would conclude, not because anyone tells me that it's not a great way of indulging, but because I see it for myself based on the pattern. And so at some point, a much more powerful mechanism happens, which is something that says, I see this is not good for me. I see it based on the pattern, and I don't want to do it. And it becomes not the sort of resistance that we have when we shouldn't do something, because we've been told we shouldn't, or because we see a consequence, but we haven't seen it in a way from giving ourselves total freedom. We often do something like that with a whole lot of guilt, having tried to stop it, and then the impulse is too strong and we do it. And so when we do it and then we see a negative consequence, but the fact that we tried to stop it before actually doing it from I shouldn't, that resistance in a way prevents a standing back and a real clarity of the dynamic. And so in my experience, I found just there's no rules about what I should or shouldn't do, and I did it. But I also found that what I felt like doing, what I was driven to do, wasn't particularly extreme, right? Because of my makeup. So that's why I'm saying this might not be appropriate for someone, because if we say there's no rules, some people might be driven to do things that I would set rules for myself if they were happening for me. So I don't really know. I can only speak from my experience. And so take this particular, that's why I say start small, start with the inconsequential things, see if it works. There is a lot of, in my experience, there was a lot of learning from experience and tweaks to the process. Certain insights would happen that would allow me to rationalize things in certain ways that would help the process. So good luck.
I have one more kind of question related to it. It's about the top-down, bottom-up approach. And like several years ago, I had this, I don't know if it was awakening. In the hindsight, it could be more of a intellectual insight, but there was a strong freeing experience that stayed for a while, for months, and continued for longer, where, like, I guess all the should and should nots dropped away. And but I heard you mention that a bottom-up approach is good after an insight of that kind of beingness or isness. So how to determine, like, what is the right place to start? Or do they go together?
They do go together in that coming down to the bottom up approach is not forgetting the top down approach. So you had said in your previous comments, that when you are immersed in the top-down approach, then the urge to do certain things isn't there. And the reason that's the case is because, in a way, the transcendence, the resting in the formless, ceases the movement of the mind, of the uncomfortable dynamic. It sort of suspends that, usually temporarily, especially if it's in the flip-flopping phase, or if it's an initial insight or initial experience, or if you find that you are able to rest in being when you follow the prompts, or the prompts arise to take you into that beingness, but then you find it doesn't solve the deeply ingrained habits, the vasanas and the samskaras, as they would be described. So if that's the case, a seeker might think it's about going deeper and deeper into the nothingness, into the resting in being, and that in time that will solve the vasanas and the samskaras. And so we might say, oh, it's just about becoming emptier and emptier, or going deeper into nothing, being no self, which is a description you could use when the thinking stops and there is a awareness on the awareness aspect. Then we see the transitory nature of the sense of person. And so we might think it's about that sense of person dissolving more and more, and that is bound to happen if I abide in the nothingness more and more. And we conclude that because whenever we come back down to earth and there is the re-emergence of the vasanas and the samskaras, there's very much the person, the personal, that wants things to and feels like those things, those gratifications are what will give it contentment or peace or whatever. And in fact, those vasanas and samskaras don't tend to get completely eradicated just by hanging out in nothingness. And it's not that they don't at all get weakened or eradicated by the abiding in beingness, because when we abide in beingness, there is a lot of experiential feedback to the peace that is available in the transcendence of that psychological identity. And that's why we then assume that it is about transcending that psychological identity. And often we think transcending it means not attending to it. Whereas one of the ways that transcending happens is, another way of describing it is a dissolution, a dissolving of the psychological identity. And that dissolution might happen by us coming very much back into the body rather than what could become a sort of spiritual bypassing out in the nothingness. And so it's good for us to hear this, because we might have concluded, because of the way that our seeking has unfolded, where we started off being exposed to, the top-down abiding in I am, which is very valuable, but our thinking tends to take things and make them very one-sided, and so we might not have any clue that coming back into the body is beneficial. In fact, we might have a concept that says, no, that is the opposite of abiding in the nothing, and that is bound to strengthen the self and the person. And in fact, if we come back to the body, we can start to see dynamics and see the egoic self more clearly, because instead of transcending it, where we sort of lose touch with what it is, where really the practice becomes a practice of allowing it to move. Because when we're transcending, even if we are feeling it, if it's there, not if we're feeling it, but if it arises, we're often essentially trying to get away from it, sweep it under the carpet, go back into the nothing again. And so it might be there in a flop phase, right? We might not successfully go into the nothing. We might be wishing we could, but it just doesn't happen. And so there's the uncomfortableness, but we're not really our seeking isn't willing to be with it, to look at it, to acknowledge it, to because it's trying to get away from it, really, ultimately. Even if it can't, it wants to, and it thinks that's the answer. So if we start then looking at it from the bottom-up approach, the bottom-up approach is not really suggesting it's all about transcendence. And so the two together can work.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So on that note, that's where it becomes important to understand what suffering really is. So I wanted, what I was going to suggest when I said let's put our hand up, was, I don't often talk about the journey as a journey of enlightenment, because I'd much rather phrase it in practical terms, because we can easily be seeking enlightenment, and we could seek enlightenment for 20 years and not really ever have any clarity on what that is, because if the teaching doesn't really talk about it in practical terms, in clear terms, whenever anyone says what is enlightenment, then we essentially go back to the teaching, and if the teaching is esoteric, then our answer becomes very esoteric. And so I was essentially going to say, let's have question and answers, and let's talk about enlightenment. Because if I say, in your questions, let's talk about enlightenment, then the questions, well, for example, a question might be, so what is enlightenment? And that's a great question to dissect, to open up. Whereas we might not have that question if we stick to the path of looking at it as peace of mind. So by saying, let's talk about enlightenment, a whole new set of questions might arise in you guys. So I was about to say why in the teaching as it is laid out, it describes suffering in practical terms. And why is that important? Now, it's not particularly important when our seeking is top down, when what we're seeking is awareness, consciousness, beingness. Because in that movement, it's a movement to the end of, in that time frame, it's a stopping, just stop. And if a shift happens to beingness, awareness, consciousness, the shift is a shift where there is a silence. So there's no investigating, really. In a lot of the prompts would be stop, trying to find answers. Stop trying to think about. Stop looking at it from the world of separation, the world of objects. Be that which is much bigger, that encompasses all of this world where you tend to inhabit. And so it doesn't talk about suffering and the end of suffering and the different forms of suffering and what thought structures are at the base of suffering. But if you are going to inhabit the body, come back in, feel the feelings, feel the suffering, it's very good to know the different types of suffering. And then once in principle you know the different types of suffering, you then might come up with sort of drop-down menus of subtypes of blame, for example, subtypes of guilt. So shame or unworthiness is a subset of guilt. So we think guilt is feeling bad about, not having helped someone. I feel guilty that I didn't stop when I saw that injured animal. So when we talk about blame and guilt, we might think that it's, that feeling bad about not helping an animal, for example, or not stopping for someone that wanted a lift. And that is indeed a form of guilt, if that's what we're thinking. But guilt really means I'm not good enough, right? I feel guilty for not having stopped because it would have been a good thing to stop and help someone. Now, feeling unworthy, when we look at it, unworthy is I feel like I am not good enough to be a human being, let's say, or I am not a good enough human being to be worthy of being alive. So there is a sense of unworthiness, really means it's a deep sense of self-guilt, or a deep sense of fundamental guilt on the level of existence, your validity. So as you look at the different forms of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, and they start to be unpacked over time, and you start to see the different forms of expectation and attachment to outcome. You start to see the different forms of pride. Arrogance could be part of under the pride. You see the different forms of blame, hatred, jealousy, resentment, simple blame for someone parking their car behind your driveway and making you miss your appointment. And that also allows us to feel deep feelings of, or energetic movements that are coming up, or that might come up when we sit with our uncomfortableness. And we might then be able to see the threads of these different forms of suffering in the feeling. But if we didn't have descriptions, then we'd feel this, it'd be uncomfortable, and we wouldn't have any real frame of reference of what to look for. And so we wouldn't then be able to get to understand it better. Whereas if we start to see, okay, all uncomfortableness with oneself essentially is suffering, and all suffering is fits into one of those categories. And so then from that point of view, we can say, okay, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to sit with it. And then when you sit with it, you might start to see, oh, this is an uncomfortableness, and then you might say, is it blame? And it will feel, no, it's not blame. Is it shame? Is it guilt? Yes, it's a form of guilt. And then you might go on deeper and say, what sort of guilt? And it is maybe, it's an unworthiness. And as you, if you have these labels, they're like color swatches that you can hold up against the wall. And, you know, if the wall is a light shade of yellow and you hold up a blue swatch, it doesn't match. As soon as you hold up the light yellow shade next to the wall, you go, that's it. It matches. And so that's why it's important to have an understanding that really suffering comes from not knowing ourselves truly, comes from the false sense of self. The end of suffering is the dissolution of that false sense of self. And that's not there so we just say, I want the end of suffering. It's there to allow us to investigate and to see these deeply ingrained dynamics. And as they're seen, as the light of awareness is shone on them, they start to shift, they start to change, and we start to have insights about what is being seen, what is shifting. One of the biggest insights we might have as we are witnessing these movements is we see that they're not there all the time. They arise, and when they arise, we might have the sense, oh, Roger is uncomfortable. But when we look deeper, we might find there is just the uncomfortableness, and the sense of Roger and the uncomfortableness are all intertwined. And when the uncomfortableness fades away, Roger in that form fades away. And so in between the different arisings, there is nothing, you could say, because Roger, there isn't like a constant Roger and then he feels a certain way. There is an overall feeling that includes Roger. Roger is included in the feeling. And so when that feeling dissolves, all of Roger dissolves with the feeling and then is replaced by a new feeling. And the sense of Roger comes up in that. And so if we actually see that, if we have that insight, it is very revealing as to who we are, what we are, not intellectually, but you start to see that what feels like this very concrete entity is really a whole lot of movement of personality traits coming up at a particular moment. So we might go from feeling very anxious about something, and then our attention gets drawn somewhere else, and the anxiety might fade away, and we then realize, oh, I'm not feeling anxious anymore, which means awareness has come on to the feeling, and it was there and now it's not there. And as we look deeper, we might find, because we would say, oh, but Roger is still here. And we look more and more, and we might find that this Roger that seems to be a constant is not so constant. It comes up in the moment. Then we might see the difference, the distinction between consciousness and the different movements of thought, of personality. So hunger, we might be hungry in one moment and not in another. And so if we see hunger arises, excitement arises, anxiety arises, who is anxious? And we might say, well, Roger is anxious. But if we look at it, we find what this question, who is anxious, is basically saying there is just anxiety. And in the anxiety, there is the sense of the Roger that is meant to be anxious, or the Roger that is anxious. Now, if this gets seen, it can be revolutionary to our understanding of what we are. And some parts of what we are fall away and change, and some parts don't. So when the psychological falls away, then that doesn't keep arising. from time to time. But the biological still exists. The biological still includes aspects that are made of the same quality, i.e. not uncomfortableness of self, but something that comes up, hunger, and then fades away. So anyway, all of these explorations can take place. Harleen, hi.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
So I wanted to speak to you about this irritation that I deal with from like a lot of time. It's in a particular relation. So a lot of yoga and body work helps me because let's say even if a day of yoga I skip, then I can see it coming back every night. While you were talking to Cecilia, you said that relations, maybe the teaching is pointing out something along this line, right? The teaching is pointing out at relations where they can be self-solving. And for a moment, I could see that actually, yeah, relations can be self-solving. And still there can be so much of ease and not hatred with the other. But yeah, that sort of understanding doesn't remain for very long, because I can see that there is rage which is in place, and I cannot even make a small sweet conversation with the other, because it's really like, how could the other have done that?
Mm. Well, one thing that might help, or often helps, is if we have the experience of us having done something like that to someone else. And maybe not exactly that thing, but something that's parallel to that, or different but the same in principle. And when we start looking like becoming, keeping it real in a way, which, when the egoic sense of self is really strong, we have no interest in keeping it real, because keeping it real, which means acknowledging our imperfection a lot of the time, and seeing our imperfection, and being able to hold to acknowledge it. A lot of the time that doesn't happen when there's the egoic movement, because the egoic is just looking for gain, essentially. But once we get to the point of, like Francois said, I just want the truth, then if we're seeking truth, we tend to have more motivation for honesty. And when we're motivated for honesty, we might start admitting certain things that previously we didn't admit. And so if we start seeing how we function that way, then it becomes a bit hypocritical to criticize the other for functioning that way. A good one is, if you're you're driving and you lose your temper with other drivers, and then when another driver loses their temper with you, you sort of feel like, you shouldn't lose your temper with me. Then you look at it and you go, I'm always losing my temper with other drivers. So it's like, who am I to say to this driver, you shouldn't get angry at me, you shouldn't lose your temper at me? I do it all the time. and so, if someone, I don't know, in a group environment doesn't stand up for you, and you can imagine, well, maybe in that group environment, when I'm trying to, look cool or be part of that group, I wouldn't stand up for someone because I've got these other motivating factors moving me. Now, that doesn't make it good, but it makes it understandable in a sense, right? So maybe that helps.
Yeah. I'll try that. Yeah.
Yeah. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. I used to say to myself at that, when I was being more and more honest in a way. I don't mean honest in some principled way or some moral way, just honest in terms of it's like a description for not continuing to get angry with the other drivers and then being annoyed when other drivers are angry with us. Right? So that's what I really mean by an honesty. We stop kidding ourselves. I remember Ali, the comedian Ali G, he used to have a thing, I think his sort of call sign was keeping it real or something like that. So for a while I used to have that image in my head. Roger, you got to just keep it real.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, Terence. I'll just talk to Terence and then Kerry if her sound works, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Hi, Roger. Good to talk to you again. I have to say I've been watching a lot of your old satsangs, and I have to thank you very much. I think your teachings have had a pretty profound effect on my thinking.
Great.
And I think I had a bunch of questions. I didn't really know where to start, but I kind of feel like I'm sort of in some kind of transitional phase of experiencing some kind of changes. I'm not sure exactly what, but I remember like in your intensive on the energetic releases, I at the time, and even until now, I experienced them so strongly, and I remember you said those shifts combined with maybe some introduction of new understandings were the recipe for a change. And it seems like that's, yeah, at the time you might think, well, what would body sensations have to do with shifting a belief structure? And I guess it seems kind of weird, just like, a lot of these practices involve doing yoga. What does stretching have to do with peace of mind? They seem like two completely unrelated things, but somehow there seems to be some kind of connection to it, as I think it's, as you said, as the understanding goes deeper, something's happening with the energetic sensations I experience. So one question I had was this I amness, I guess the base consciousness in which all this stuff arises. Sometimes I wonder if it's getting clouded over, just because anytime I drop into that, I feel the sensation so strongly. Then sometimes I try to ask, well, what lies behind that? And I wonder about, well, do any practices help, in terms of kind of getting a deeper sense of the I amness and seeing the dissolution of the psychological self. And I wanted to ask you again. I remember, I think a couple months ago, Cecilia asked about the role of meditation, and you basically said, well, only meditate if you feel like it, and it doesn't help, like in the traditional sense of like being the one that's forcing yourself to do meditation. But then in other teachings, you said it might be necessary or helpful to have a moratorium of all thinking at some point. And I don't see how that's, I mean, the only practice I know of that would facilitate that is meditation. Isn't that not the case?
Sorry, I missed what I said would be important in the second, the last part that you said. So in one sense, I said don't be the meditator, and then what was the alternative?
Yeah. Well, I think I was wondering, because I think in others you mentioned how it might be useful to have a moratorium of thinking to get it, I guess, a deeper sense of maybe the I amness, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And I don't know how you would have that moratorium on thinking without meditation. Isn't that the only practice that would seem to do it?
Okay.
But then you said only meditate if you feel like it, and of course I never feel like it. So
you see, there's a difference between, you can meditate, there can be meditation and meditation. And the issue is not meditation per se, it is who is doing meditation. And true meditation, to me, is the absence of a meditator. But the reality is that teachings will land and talk, will be received by whatever structure is there. And so a lot of the time, the egoic structure is the meditator, right? That's all it knows how to do, is try to do life. So if a certain structure of thinking is in place, as soon as it hears meditation, it says, I have to do meditation. That's what I'm being told. So this teaching that talks about meditation, any teaching that talks about meditation, if the egoic structure hears that, there will be a meditator meditating. And I'll say it again, to me, true meditation, the meditation that is really being spoken about in any teaching, is the absence of a meditator. And so so you can't have true meditation if the structure of a doer is there, because as soon as that structure of the doer decides it's time to meditate, then there will be that meditator meditating. And that isn't true meditation according to the definition I just put forward. And so it's a catch-22, right? Then you might have the meditator or the doer do non-meditation or not do meditation, right? It goes, I got told not to meditate, and so then it will be the one not meditating. So and it's a catch-22, because you can't get rid of that entity that meditates or does any practice, whatever it is, and most seeking is a seeking with doership, because it's only at a certain point that the doer dissolves. And so it's the last part of the seeking that tends to become effortless, because the doer has in large part dissolved. And so then the last part of the seeking is a seeking without a seeker. But there is still seeking happening. But the experience that the person has is, they might even say, oh, seeking isn't happening, because they remember the seeking where the seeker was there, right? And then when there is seeking without a seeker, as in without someone, that entity who is always trying to do, when that's fallen away, it feels very different. And so if I say, is seeking still happening? Someone might say, no, seeking isn't happening. What they're really saying is the seeker has dissolved. And so they're saying, what I would say they're really saying is, my seeking has changed significantly in its quality. There still is seeking, because you might still put on a YouTube video and watch it. But it's not, you're not putting on the YouTube video from the same impulse that you might have been putting on the YouTube video before. The seeker might say, I don't have any idea of how my seeking is going to look today, because the seeker that used to feel like it had to control the seeking has dissolved. And so now the seeker, the person through which seeking is now happening, would call it differently, because it is different. But the reality is, seeking is still happening, because watching videos on spiritual stuff is still happening. But you could say without the seeker-doer there. And at some point, you find yourself not seeking, because you're not reading spiritual books, you're not listening to stuff, because you're not suffering, and it all seems irrelevant. Like, why would I listen to 2 hours on someone telling me about enlightenment when it, in a sense, it's not relevant? Because the process has taken you to a point where seeking simply stops. Not only seeking without a seeker, but even, not only the seeker with the seeker, seeking with the seeker, that falls away, but even the seeker without the seeker falls away. And so, what was I getting at? So this moratorium on thinking is essentially an encouragement that we need to have, which says, you won't ever find your true nature through thinking. You won't know reality through thought. And so at a certain point of our seeking, if that really sinks in, then we might see how we are continually trying to understand what is spoken about. We are like saying, oh, I need to find the true self. And we might be thinking about what the true self is according to the descriptions in the teaching that we've heard. And we're saying, I don't get it, but if I think about it a bit more, I might get it. I might understand the self. And so the teaching that says you're never going to understand the self through thinking. So just stop and be. And that includes, for a period, the working mind as well. And so what that might do, if someone finds themselves particularly gripped with, like, getting that thinking is the problem. So when someone really sees that I'm continually trying to think about it. And it's outside of thinking. Then there can be this movement where thinking gets interrupted, once a day or maybe 10 times in an hour, because the seeker then is moving to a point of just of essentially their practice, hopefully without someone trying to stop thinking. Because if there is, once again, the doer trying to not think, that isn't really the stopping that can happen. The stopping that can happen is just where deep in the system there's been a realization that I spend my whole life thinking and trying to do things. Doing things really means thinking about what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it and what the consequence is going to be, what the benefit is going to be, what I'll get when I've finished doing it. And so when our system gets it, that is suffering, that is the entity that is completely deluded about where freedom is found. That is the entity that is attached to outcome. And it's trying to get outcomes. It's trying to do life. It's trying to do outcomes. So when our system gets it, it just then can spontaneously stop. Because it doesn't need to think about stopping. Something in the system just says stop. And stop means, so stop becomes the bookend of thinking. Stop is a thought, right? The thought stop is a thought. But as long as that becomes the bookend to the thinking, rather than, I think I need to stop. Okay, so how am I going to stop? Okay, so I'm going to stop by, so now stop thinking now. Have I stopped? I think I've stopped. That's not stopping. That's thinking we can stop thinking through thinking. And we might need to do that a lot for us to really realize I can't stop by thinking about stopping, because if I think about stopping, that's more thinking. So when that becomes really clear, somewhere it just goes, I have to stop. And we go from a natural movement that rolls us back into thinking, as in, because that's the only tool we've ever used, is to think ourself into existence and out of problems. And we might have this insight that says, it's about stop.
Is that what your point was in one of your videos? I remember you talked about how I'm going to ask you a question. It's going to be what's on the table, and I'm going to tell the answer that what's on the table is an apple. And you kept repeating. I think you were trying to point out that once we think we know the answer, we don't even look. And I was wondering, is that sort of like a version of like the self-inquiry practices? Because I was like, when you look for yourself, your mind just keeps saying, I'm me, I'm Terrence, but that wasn't actually looking. And then I think I had some shift when I realized I don't know how to look for myself without using thought, without thinking about it. And I don't know how to look for anything without using thought. Was that what that practice was? It was kind of like a self-inquiry type thing to point out how.
Yeah, that's pointing to the fact that we, our thinking is so habitual that when we think about and create an image of thought, a projection into the future or thinking about a problem, we essentially create a world that holds that scenario that we're thinking of. Like a business outcome. Let's say we might be thinking about having our own business and being self-sufficient or whatever. And it creates a conceptual image of that. And we're so familiar with that image of reality, or that we think that that is somehow it. And the reality is outside of that dimension of thought. That isn't reality. But for as long, because it's always been how we think about things, we get stuck in that dimension, not realizing it is that is a dimension of thought, and that isn't the, what we could say, reality. That isn't the real arena, or the and it's only when it becomes apparent to us that that arena is not what is being pointed at, that there might be the seeing beyond that dimension of thought, of conceptualizing things. And so in the video you're talking about, I say, what is on the table in the corner of the room? And I had said I described what was on the table, and I described it as an apple. But then when I describe it in all of the detail, someone might take that as the truth. And I'm saying, well, no, but look at the table in the corner of the room and see the apple. And they might be looking sort of in their image of the table with the apple on it that I have described, not realizing that that is not the thing itself. The thing itself, act my description of it, and just what I'm talking about and describing and whatever, and you're just seeing the thing itself. Right? And so that was just a metaphor for how we may never look, thinking that we are seeing the apple because it's being described and we're creating maybe a mental image of it or whatever. So yes, the end of thinking, or the capacity, we find the capacity for thinking to stop, usually is the end of a process where we do a whole lot of trying to stop thinking through thought, and eventually we see the futility of that, and we see the fact that if I keep approaching it through the process of thinking itself is never actually stopping. So, yes.
Thanks. Oh, and referring to the earlier point, I was wondering, so you referred to, going back to the energetic sensations, you called them loads of doership. And I think you'd hardly find that description of these seemingly very physical sensations anywhere. And I was wondering, how did you come to that conclusion through your own experience and observation of, like, how does that translate to, these sensations in the body translate to the feeling of personal doership? Or how did you make that connection?
Well, in principle, and not only in theory, but you can then start feeling it. But the theory is that any of these loads, energetic loads, that are essentially expressions of the small self, the egoic self, the thing, or rather, the theory is that these loads are expressions of the egoic self, and the egoic self is doership and attachment. So any of those movements ultimately have to, at their core, have doership and attachment as the root. That's the theory, and then you might be able to experience that in practice. When you feel those energies, they might start to reveal themselves that way. So that the theory says, yes, that's what you'll find at the core. And it was my experience.
I see. And when those sensations arise, you would have actual memories or images of what they were about in terms of being the agent or
You will, or I did, but I think it's very dependent on how much space there is in the system, right? If the system is quite clogged up with these energies, then the witnessing or the clarity of the layers might not be there. It might still be just one big ball of stuff. And so when you experience it, you don't experience it with the same clarity that might be there when the system has emptied out much more. And so when the system has emptied out, then you might start to be able to see the doership, the attachment, and have certain visions of where these energies originated from, i.e. what circumstance in life they originated from, which could include visions that don't relate to this particular body, but turn out to be visions of another life, another human experience. But, so saying that can be the case doesn't mean it's going to be available, because the clutter might be too condensed at some points for that clarity to be there. And then at other times it might present that way.
and does I mean, from your experience with other people, looking at other people, does it typically take years for them to click? So if somebody experiences these very strongly, does it take, like in my case, I mean, it's been like in the past year, it's subsided quite a bit, but still very strong. I was wondering, will there come a point where they're mostly cleaned out, or is that just something to live with?
I mean, the movement is a movement of reducing, clearing out, unloading, and I guess it depends on where you start from, or how quickly the process is dumping stuff out, as to how quickly it moves from one sensation or one qualitative sense to a different qualitative sense. So in theory, we're always moving in that direction. In practice, whether it takes 3 months or 10 years, is going to be, well, we could just say your destiny, which is also dependent on, let's say, the load and its particular makeup, will determine what one's destiny will look like. So I wouldn't be discouraged. I think there's a lot of stuff going on, and in 6 months you'll look back and you'll say, wow, it hasn't ended, but it's changing.
Okay,
or you might say,
Thanks,
you might be able to say it's ended. So we've come to the end. Let me just have a quick chat with Kerry, and then we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Terence. Hi, Kerry.
Roger, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, good. Roger, really quick. From the first Zoom, I felt shame because I exposed myself to the world, and I felt, embarrassed. And then the second video, again, I felt embarrassed because I talked too much and I didn't let speak. So the up-to-date conditioning is, okay, it's all good. I don't feel shame anymore. And I will ask a question and sit back and listen. So I feel like I learned a lot about Zooming in the first 2 Zooms I've ever done in this 67 life. all is well, and I appreciate you, Roger.
Thank you. You're very welcome. I can't say that I can remember it standing out as particularly something to be embarrassed about. But if you got something out, or you had some insights around that, that's very good. So did you want to say more than that? Were you going to ask a question today?
No, hon. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my son just called and I lost contact. No, I won't ask a question. All is well. And so I'll sit back in being and I'll watch the storyline. And I love all you guys. I think we're all very blessed to have you, Roger.
Thank you, Kerry. On that note, then, which is great, given we've come to the end of our time, I'll say goodbye.